NVIDIA just announced 3 new GPUs today. They announced the RTX 4060, the 4060 Ti, and the 4060 Ti 16GB. The pricing for these is $400 for the 4060 Ti 8GB model. It's $500 for the 4060 Ti 16GB model, and then the 4060 is to be determined at this point. Release dates have the 4060 Ti 8GB coming out first. That's going to be May 24th when it's available, and then the 4060 Ti 16GB and the 4060 non-Ti both will be available at some point in July. The date's not yet known. So today we'll be covering the specs, NVIDIA's VRAM decisions, their cache discussion, and how to do some calculations on bandwidth, how the canonical view of a pipeline works for cache and memory, to just set the stage for the impending launch of the 4060 Ti's with the 2 different memory capacities. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermaltake and their new Series 500TG ARGB mid-tower case. The Thermaltake series case is perforated all on the front panel and the power supply shroud, including perforations on the cable side of the case for further ventilation to the PSU and hard drive chamber of the case. A separate access door for hard drives makes the case easy to work with for 3.5-inch storage, or the door can be swapped out for a separate LCD panel kit that displays system information. Other features include a GPU support kit, vertical mounting, and a hinged glass panel. Learn more at the link in the description below. So we're not wasting time on this one, we're going straight into the specs. The 4060 Ti 8GB model mirrors the 3060 Ti's MSRP, so that's remained the same, but what we care more about is the performance relative to that pricing, in other words, the effective value. Plus, there's an AMD RX 7600 around the corner. This is going to be lower end than definitely the 4060 Ti. Might line up more with the 4060, we're not sure yet, we'll have to see how they line up, but the 7600 at this point is in the rumor mill, and we'd expect it coming out sometime within the next month based on the rumors that have been posted thus far. So for NVIDIA's launch, it will not be launching Founders Edition models for the 4060 Ti 16GB or for the 4060, but it will be launching an FE model for the 4060 Ti 8GB, where the partners will fill in the gaps for the other cards and of course have their own launches for the 8GB model. The company noted a total GPU power of 160 watts with 2 prices listed again because the 16GB model will be $500. As expected, features like DLSS 3 and AV1 both moved to the 40 series from where they were lacking on the 30 series, but these features are not new to the 4060 cards, they've already been on the 40 series cards. Moving to the next spec sheet from NVIDIA, the 4060 is only available in an 8GB SKU, which makes sense because it likely lacks the power required to leverage more, and it moves to a TGP of 115 watts. This is a generational reduction in the power targets for the 60 SKU naming. As for how well a 4060 or 4060 Ti might leverage 16 versus 8GB, we'll see in testing. The maybe more confusing thing though is that the 4070 exists, and that's 12GB. So once again, we end up in the same situation we were in with the 30 series, where there are lower end cards coming out with higher capacities of memory, which just causes confusion within the market, especially for the least informed buyers who look at the table and they're like, this number's bigger, I'll buy that one. Now, NVIDIA doesn't have a good history or track record with product naming and memory changes. There's a few examples. So the GT 1030, there was a GDDR5 version and a DDR4 version, and that one we believed was confusing to the point of being damaging to the consumer and misleading because the only change in the name was they would sometimes append a D4 to the end of the SKU, which just looks like any product name. So it was really potentially misleading to the extent of losing more than 50% of your performance sometimes if you bought the DDR4 version, but you intended to buy the GDDR5 version. So that creates some skepticism for their changes of memory spec to what else might change in the card, and we'll get to that in a second. Now, the next one is the RTX 4080, which is more recent in memory. There was supposed to be a 16GB and a 12GB version. It was famously unlaunched and then relaunched as the 4070 Ti. And the reasoning for that is because NVIDIA changed not only the memory, despite only changing the name of the card to reflect the memory change, it also changed other specifications such as the actual GPU core configuration, where you ran a significantly slimmer core, and that's what led to them unlaunching it, which was the right move, so at least they did that. But as for the 4060 Ti, the good news is that they're not doing that again. So hopefully this is an indication that NVIDIA has learned the lesson and is like, yes, if we name the thing 4060 Ti 8 and 4060 Ti 16, perhaps that is the only thing we should change is the 8 and the 16. And in this instance, that is the only thing they're changing. So they confirmed with us that there is no other difference between the two GPUs other than the memory spec, which is how it should be. So that's good. And it's definitely okay to have two models of a card with just different memory capacities, again, as long as the rest of it doesn't change because of the message it communicates to the consumer. NVIDIA isn't listing the bus width explicitly in this simplified table, probably because they're concerned it would look bad, but there's some caveats to it that we're gonna explore here. The 3060 Ti had a 256-bit bus. The 2060 Super also had a 256-bit wide bus or memory interface. And we do have the memory bandwidth, so we can calculate the bus width. The formula is memory bus width divided by 8, and that converts the bus width to bytes. And then you multiply by the memory clock, you multiply by 2 for DDR, and then you multiply by 2 again for GDDR. We don't know the bus width here, which is x, so basic algebra allows us to solve for x. We know the clock speed of NVIDIA's GDDR6 already, so x divided by 8 times 4500 times 2 equals 288 gigabytes per second. If we move x around, x solves for 128 bits. Also, I asked NVIDIA how many bits is it, and they said 128. Did we do way more work than is necessary? Yes, but now you know how to do the formula. So that might be useful in the future. We thought it'd be fun to teach because as this continues to come up in instances where that number may be obfuscated, you might be able to solve for it on your own now, instead of just asking them, which also works. Now that 128 number, obviously much lower than the 256 number. There are trade-offs in any kind of architecture or product design though, so we were willing to hear the arguments. And that's where we get into the memory problem, where the discussion of cache versus memory capacity and memory bandwidth and how NVIDIA sees its trade-offs working right now. NVIDIA's bus shows that the memory bandwidth runs significantly slower than previous generations of GPUs when going by purely the hard numbers. Just like CUDA cores, though, aren't the same generationally, how much bandwidth is needed also changes across architecture. Most notably, we saw the difference in bandwidth requirements on the Vega architecture, where AMD went with HBM, which is what made it difficult for the company to compete because HBM was so expensive, or high bandwidth memory, that it couldn't simply drop the prices, at least not until it got really dire for Radeon at that time. But without HBM, they would have been bandwidth starved in a way that the products just wouldn't have been competitive. So the needs of each generation are a little different. So we asked NVIDIA to make its case for the bandwidth changes that we've been seeing on the recent cards, and NVIDIA presented the case as this. They noted that a 32 megabyte L2 cache versus the previous 4 megabyte L2 cache is a massive increase, and there's also a reduction in latency between the L2 cache and the cores. That should encourage more cache hits, and that's just a fact. That's not NVIDIA's opinion. NVIDIA previously ran 2 megabytes of cache for roughly every 128 bits of memory interface. If it followed that format for the new card, it would have landed at about 2 megabytes of L2 for the 4060 Ti. Now, maybe you can compensate with double the memory and more die area for the bus, which is probably what they would have done in the past, but then that also increases cost in a new area. Memory silicon isn't cheap either. Now, the increase in cache and reduction in bandwidth is fine as long as you always or primarily stay within the cache for your most important stuff. But we did ask the question of, does this reduced bandwidth become a problem once your cache is filled and is not useful for the current transaction, whatever that might be? So in other words, are there instances where the older configuration of smaller cache, more bandwidth, would be more viable or useful? The answer was sometimes, but of course NVIDIA believes that the benefits here for the change outweigh the losses, which it's not like that's news. Of course they would believe that or they wouldn't have done it. So NVIDIA noted that there are some benefits to raw bandwidth, but it believes this configuration is better overall, and it does allow some die area savings or reallocation away from bandwidth. And also, if you were going to go the route of just increasing the memory capacity to help offset some of the potential losses for smaller cache, that's a big cost increase. NVIDIA doesn't want a big cost increase because NVIDIA wants its margin, and you would have to pay more for that, so MSRP goes up, so they get yelled at, and they are also less competitive as compared to someone like AMD or Intel right now. So there's a lot of competitive reasons they made this decision too, and it's mostly, on that end, cost control. But then it also claims these performance reasons being beneficial. We next asked NVIDIA what's required to make the frame buffer interface larger. The company told us that a larger FB interface requires space primarily along the edges of the die, which is actually pretty interesting information, and that would direct how big the die is. Higher die area means, of course, higher cost to manufacture and higher defect rates, or lower yields, in other words. So this could be either looked at as additional cost control or as a reallocation of a fixed area that they were bound to anyway to other aspects of the GPU. And both of these are reasonable interpretations. It doesn't really matter what the reason is ultimately, because when we test it, we'll see how it does, and we'll know if the value is any good. So you should check back for the review for commentary on if this product makes any sense, of course. This one, though, so we asked NVIDIA how it calculates that effective number. It has that 554 gigabytes per second effective. Effective in this context always means not real, but they're trying to take two things that are not linearly or directly comparable and figure out how to make them directly comparable. That's typically where you would see effective bandwidth come into play. And it's not the first time that number's come up from any company. They've all done it at some point. So it's a purely hypothetical number of how do we equate these things which are intrinsically not equatable. So the company told us that it looks at the traffic reduction across the bus to memory, and NVIDIA said, quote, in this case it's roughly 50% or 52% approximately. You have 52% less traffic on the bus than you did previously. So that's how it's coming up with this number. And as for the reasoning why, it's because of the increased L2 cache. So NVIDIA ran some tests. They're not fully like for like, but they also really can't be because we're dealing with hypothetical products at this point. So they did this to try and showcase the difference between a 2 megabyte and a 32 megabyte GPU in terms of the cache for VRAM traffic per frame. And that's using this card as the hypothetical. This chart still didn't normalize for memory bandwidth or a theoretical necessary increase in memory capacity to compensate. So in other words, it's not a perfect representation, and we're not seeing the true walkthrough of how would they have actually executed on this if they stayed confined to 2 megabytes of cache. So that chart is basically saying that NVIDIA's findings indicate that the increased cache significantly reduces the reliance on VRAM, and it's clear to us, just reading between the very widely spaced lines, that this is sort of an indirect response to the recent criticisms about NVIDIA's VRAM capacity. And as stated earlier, we'll see in testing. If there are memory capacity issues with it, then it should be pretty evident. Depends on the game you're using and things like texture pack size, but we'll look at that. So NVIDIA is claiming an increase of 15% over the 3060 Ti when tested correctly in a like-for-like scenario, or an increase of 70% when tested with totally different, incomparable technologies that don't exist on all products under test, like DLSS 3 backing the 4060 Ti. The company also had a chart of the 4060 Ti 8GB versus a few prior cards, except it's only showing data for the 4060 Ti with DLSS 3, which leads us to wonder if it'd be too boring to speak of otherwise. So if it's not the case that the 4060 Ti is too boring, lackluster, or low in performance in a true like-for-like scenario against the 30 series, then all we really want from NVIDIA, and hopefully NVIDIA is listening here, is to see a version of this chart in the future with a fourth bar. If we had exactly this chart, but one more bar, they could do everything they want. They could say, here's DLSS 3, and here's a proper like-for-like scenario where that bar would be the new product without DLSS 3. Either they match the technology version, so DLSS 2 maybe, between the two products being compared, or they eliminate it entirely and they just test it standalone rasterization, no DLSS whatsoever to help out, no RT, whatever the case may be, as long as the technologies are the same. If we're showing RT, then do the same version for each. Obviously, that allows you to see the difference between the RT core performance generationally and also maybe core increases or decreases. If we're showing DLSS, we should show the same DLSS version. If you want to show a product that has a feature the other doesn't have, that's fine, but make sure there is a bar on that chart that shows it without the feature and with the playing field leveled. So this does lead us to wonder if there's a problem with performance or if NVIDIA perceives a problem with performance. And hopefully that sentence is the one that makes NVIDIA go, that's not the message we want to convey. Let's add the other bar. Now, when we brought up this criticism with NVIDIA in the call for this news announcement, NVIDIA responded with a question, and I think it was an interesting one and a fair one from their position, where obviously the bias is DLSS 3 is very beneficial for us to show. Let's make sure we focus on that. I think if we take it at face value, they're trying to understand why is the press so resistant to this, then this question makes sense. So the question was, if you were going to test two cars or review two cars in a corner, perhaps for speed through that corner, and one had traction control and the other one did not, what would you do? Would you disable traction control on the one that had it or something else? And my answer to that was immediate. I don't review cars, but I knew exactly what I would want to see on a chart if I'm looking at that data. And it's pretty simple. I would do all the tests. So you do one without traction control on either of them. You do one with the new feature, let's pretend traction control is new, on the competing car. And then you look at both those sets of numbers and you can have a full picture of what's going on. NVIDIA's argument is basically, this is an included feature, we think people will use it, therefore it's fair to compare against it. And I think that's fair, but only if you have the other aspect of that picture too. And the car analogy, while very interesting and definitely made me think a bit, it's not a complete picture of this, because in the car analogy, you always have traction control. It is always present in the car that has the feature. Maybe it doesn't work quite as well in some scenarios or whatever, but it's always there. It's not like you get on a road and it's not compatible with traction control. If you're on asphalt in one state or another, it's still there. So that feature, it's not quite the same as comparing to DLSS, and in that way is maybe a sort of a false dichotomy. I don't think maliciously, I think it's just, I had to think about it a little bit to come to that conclusion. And as such, in this instance, there are a few problems. First is that not everyone wants to use DLSS, which is why in the car analogy, if you don't want to use traction control in a certain scenario, it helps to have the data of how does it do with it off. But what really matters here is that not everyone likes DLSS 3, so disabling it gives that information. The second one is not every application supports it, and as such, we believe it'd be the most transparent to show a bar for DLSS entirely off, or at least locked to the same version. It's not like it's that hard to run the additional tests anyway, especially at NVIDIA's size. So how cache is useful? So this part isn't an NVIDIA claim, this is just fact of how it works. So more cache means more cache hits, and hopefully anyway, if it's working right, and more cache residency, which should indicate fewer transactions to other parts of memory within the entire computer. Typically it would be the closest memory next, so that would be VRAM. But there's less need to transact across the bus to GPU memory if the cache is working properly and if it's increased, as you see on the X3D parts. Now, we're gonna go super basic here to get everyone up to speed on sort of the canonical view of a pipeline for cache, memory, system memory, and so forth. This might be something you know, but with the recent increase in sort of the new members of our audience, we wanted to bring it back to basics here, and there'll be timestamps if you want to skip it. But let's say it all starts with a call for some sort of data, like a video game texture. The GPU will first check within its closest cache, and then it goes to the next cache. You might have something like L1 or L2. If there are 3 layers of cache, it would hit L3 next. And after it exhausts all options and fails to find the texture file, it next transacts across the bus between the GPU and the memory module surrounding it. It's likely that the GPU finds the file in this memory. However, the bus adds physical distance and a slower interface than the interconnect found within the GPU core. You can relate this back to Infinity Fabric on AMD Ryzen CPUs, where ideally you look first within the same CCD and its cache, and then maybe you have to transact across Infinity Fabric to the next CCD and look in the cache over there. If you can't find any other location, the next step would be for the CPU to go down the bus to memory, system memory, and look within system memory. And that creates all kinds of physical distance slowdowns, plus the interfaces just run slower and slower at each stage, typically anyway. So it's likely the GPU finds the file in memory, but if the GPU has insufficient video memory to store all of the most immediately needed information for the game, like the most recently called texture, it's next forced to go look somewhere else, and that's going to be system memory. This is a huge reduction in speed as soon as you hit system memory, because you begin transacting across the PCIe bus and interface to the CPU, and then from the CPU to the memory, and then you bring it all back down the same lines to the GPU. Again, that's extremely basic stuff. None of this is new or particularly transformative on our side, but for those of you who are newer to this industry or to PCs, hopefully it helps. We're not even getting into things like just the different types of cache. There are different types as well. The next obvious question is, why not just add more cache? And the answer is more than cache, as in money, but also area. They all kind of relate to each other though. With a silicon product, you have a limited area, and you can allocate that area to things like logic, cache, encoders, interfaces, or other types of technologies. And each one of those things, you add more cores, you're taking away from other things that could be there instead. Maybe it is as simple as trading cores for cache, but it normally isn't, because they have to try and balance the product to get the best outcome. So in the instance of a GPU, if you're oversupplied on cache, but you are undersupplied on compute capabilities for whatever it is the card's supposed to do, like FP32 single precision, FP64 double precision, whatever it is, then the cache may end up useless, and you're starved for that other resource more frequently or in a more significant way than you would be for cache. So cache is physically within the silicon of the GPU or the CPU, and it could take the place of other parts. Of course, the other option is to make the silicon bigger, but that gets expensive very fast, and NVIDIA is trying to keep the die size as small as possible. That's why they don't shove more cache into just everything, although AMD has found a new solution, which is to shove more cache on top of at least the CPUs as a separate die. And even there, we've seen that it doesn't always help. It depends on the application, and it does increase the cost. So we bring all this up because cache is going to be the focal point of NVIDIA's defense for why is it a lower memory bandwidth and why less memory. That's how they are answering the question, and that's how all that stuff works. So it should hopefully help people start formulating their own opinions. But what actually matters, once again, is the test data. So none of this right now really matters because we haven't tested the product, so we don't know what its performance is going to look like, especially in the arena of memory capacity and bandwidth. But anyway, that's it for the announcement. We have more of this as we ramp into the reviews, of course, but we're going to be talking about performance very soon. You should check back for that. As a reminder, the RX 7600 is right around the corner, so we'll have those reviews in theory at some point, but we'll see how the rumors play out. And that card will be targeting, in theory, a different audience, but how much it's different, we'll see once the price is officialized. Let us know what you think of the educational section we had in here, just about the super basics of cache and sort of presenting how it works. If that's useful to you, great, we'll do more of it. And if not, that's fine too, just let us know. And next time we'll focus on just the actual hard specs of the news and the commentary on it without the educational part. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab a shirt like this one. They are running out, by the way, and they're limited, so you'll want to get one, and we'll see you all next time.